Hello and welcome everyone to India Factoring Chat Show, a one-stop solution for global aspirations. First of all, thank you for everyone who's joined in and patiently waiting for us. We've been a little delayed. Technical difficulties, I think, still persist with everyone. So, without wasting a lot of any more time, my name is Neil Shah. I will be your host for today. We have a very eminent and well-respected speaker who's joined us today. So we'll directly get into it. For all our viewers who've joined us for the first time, I'll quickly give an introduction about India Factoring, followed by an introduction of our speaker. Okay, so India Factoring is a premier trade finance institution registered with RBI as an authorized dealer 3 category in 2009. It also holds an NBFC factor license. Our flagship offering is the non-recourse product, which helps client avail factoring without the facility appearing as a liability on the balance sheet. Such niche structured trade finance products from India Factoring offer ease and flexibility in managing working capital requirements of businesses by funding an agreed percentage of invoices soon after shipment of goods. We are world number 7 and have been market leaders in export factoring in India since 2018. We are number one in export factoring in India since 6 years, as I mentioned. We have been recognized with various national and international awards like FCI Best Deal of the Year Award, FCI Marketing Award, Top 25 Safest Places to Work. So that's a little bit about India Factoring. Now, coming to the introduction of our well esteemed speaker today, Dr. Badri Narayan Gopal Krishnan. He's an economist, data scientist, and interdisciplinary researcher with over 2 decades of experience in academic, government, corporate, and startup setting. He's a former diplomat, management consultant, policy advisor, and he's published over 10 books and 250 research papers, articles, and op-eds in leading journals, magazines, and newspapers with thousands of citations and media coverage. Uh, he served at Government of India at the rank of Joint Secretary and lead advisor of the Head of Trade, Commerce, and Strategic Economic Dialogue. He's also served as a senior advisor and consultant to many governments like Saudi Arabia, UAE, USA, Canada, etc. Uh, he's worked with senior leading corporates such as McKinsey, PwC, KPMG, uh, and he's also established a new global analytics consulting firm, Infisum, which has offices and clients all across the world. So that was a brief introduction about a speaker, Dr. Badri. We welcome you to the chat show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Neil. Looking forward to many discussions today.
Sure. I will not take our viewers any more time. I think we've been a little delayed, so I'll get into the first question straight away with you. So I was just reading an article where I saw your input about CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So what we are calling it in simple words, something called carbon tax, and the EU countries are supposedly planning to be more restrictive in it, and which is going to affect Indian exporters. So I would just like you to highlight for our listeners what exactly is this carbon tax and what effect is it going to have for Indian exporters going ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Neil, for a very topical and important question. Uh, Carbon border adjustment mechanism has been announced by the EU, and they have already started working on it. And the uh, the original purpose and the intentions of the EU to do something like this has a long history. It has been there on the cards for a long time. But the original idea is for them to do two things at a time. One is to ensure that there is sustainability, reduction of emissions, and so on that happen not only within the EU but also in the countries that supply commodities to the EU. That is kind of the stated goal or stated objective of the wide range of environmental policies that the Europeans link with trade since the past couple of decades ago. Now, the second objective or second goal is, which we as developing countries realize, is that Europeans want to give a level playing field for their domestic industry. Since their domestic industry, according to them, predominantly works on low emission intensities, they think that by imposing these taxes and tariffs on products coming from other countries based on emissions, they could provide a level playing field for their domestic industry, and this is more like a protectionism kind of argument. So now these are the broad premise of the CBAM, or why would a country or a group of countries impose tariffs based on emissions. That is basically what is CBAM. So if you export anything to the EU, or not anything, they have come up with a few commodities in the beginning, like cement, steel, aluminum, and so on. So now in these commodities, if you are exporting to the EU, they will look at what are the emissions that you are generating, and then they'll say, okay, since you are generating so much emissions, you have to pay the carbon taxes that the Europeans would pay. So not the carbon, like it's not about carbon tax in the local currency, but in euros. For example, if let's say Tata Steel is exporting steel to the EU, Tata may argue that, okay, in order to have an impact of reducing emissions in India, if the Indian government comes with a carbon tax, that may be far lower than the carbon tax that the Europeans are imposing. So we are willing to pay that kind of a tax. We are not willing to pay the kind of tax that you guys are saying. But that argument will not hold, because these Europeans have come up with this policy in explicitly stating that you have to pay this 80 or 90 euros per ton of carbon dioxide that the Europeans have as carbon price. So now that is the broad premise. So now, if you think about the implications, like including that article and a few other articles that I wrote on this topic, the implications are that if you take Indian exporters as an example, so they are going to face these tariffs, as if these are basically tariffs, custom duties. So they are going to face them, and to the extent to which they have exposure to the EU market, there will be some increase in prices, and probably some reduction in demand. There are two things here. One is, you don't reduce emissions, you keep emitting whatever you are emitting, and then you pay the taxes. Or you reduce emissions, export green steel for example, and then you don't pay any carbon taxes. It's going to depend on the emission intensity of your production. So that is going to be the main concern in the exports from India, for example. So now the government is also cognizant of these issues, and there are some solutions being thought about. One important solution is to come up with a emissions trading scheme within India, so that emission reduction is incentivized, it happens, there is a market for carbon emissions, and that way by the time they go to the European market, they will already have figured out how to reduce emissions and so on. The second, and that is in progress, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has instituted a process for starting this ETS kind of thing in India. Now that is one thing. The other thing that is being thought about is to fight the European Union's decision to do this unilaterally in the WTO. So because it's not, we can argue that it's not WTO consistent, although the Europeans would argue that they have done it in a very WTO compliant way, consistent way. They are not imposing different taxes on the imports than on the domestic. They are going to say that we have all these carbon taxes in EU, we are imposing the same carbon taxes on the import. So that way the national treatment or the MFN treatment is going to be not a problem. But one can argue that MFN treatment is missing here because they do have some special provisions for their other allies like EFTA countries and so on, European Free Trade Agreement countries and so on. So there is some ground in which we can argue, and and there are other like-minded countries, not only India but also many other developing countries, some other Middle Eastern countries, Latin American countries, African countries. So many of them are concerned about this because many countries, particularly if you look at African countries, many of them are just beginning to industrialize, and now if you say that you have to pay this carbon tax, they are going to be suffering. So there has been that effort going on where we are trying to come up with some alliances to help on this. And the third thing we are trying to do is to, which I mean, it's not yet in the governments. It's not being discussed within the government, but many academics and experts are talking about it. And that is, why don't you have an explicit carbon tax in India? If you have an explicit carbon tax in India, uh, to maybe close to the extent of what the Europeans are charging, then what happens is we can have a scheme. We can actually collect those. We can keep, at least we can keep that money within India, in the government, and then the government can make sure that that money is earmarked for industrial development. That is being used for sustainability, industrial development. So in a way, you capture the tax and then distribute it as some kind of subsidies. But again, this can be challenged in the WTO if we do it too explicitly. For example, if Tata pays some carbon tax to the government and then the government gives that back to Tata as subsidy, then it will be questioned. But it has to be in some other ways. So that is a tricky proposition. But these are the different things that are on cards because either we just uh, comply and have this kind of emission trading scheme, or you fight with them, or you come up with like make sure that anyway we are going to spend that money, why don't we keep it within the country? So these are the different discussions that are going on right now. But in terms of timetable, this has already kicked in. The kind of assessment, measurement, the Europeans are looking at collecting the data, looking at what is the carbon intensity of various production of various commodities in India and other countries. They started it a few months ago in 2023, late 2023, I think October, and I think in 2025, 26 they will start implementing it. So that's where we are, and yes, it's going to be a very important thing. Right now they may say there are only a bunch of commodities, but and actually speaking, we don't have so much exposure to Indians. Don't have so much exposure to the European market in these commodities. However, in the future, this can be a big issue. They can expand to other commodities too. So then we'll be in trouble.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thank you
Uh,
so much for that detailed explanation for our viewer. Thank you so much for the detailed explanation for our viewers. Before I take a question that has come up from Mr. Rajasri, I just want to follow up with a little bit of discussion with what you just said. As you said, there are two things that Indian exporters will be able to do. One, either will be paying taxes with the same carbon emission that we are doing currently. So by paying the taxes, it's still affecting your bottom line at the end of the day. Or you go with the eco-friendly way, green energy or something to reduce the carbon emissions, which again is going to come with a cost. So there's a contradictory view, as you said, goes on in developing nations that US, Europe, they've already had the industrial revolution. They've emitted huge amounts of carbon during their times. It's the developing nations' time to grow now. And when it's their chance, we are putting such restrictions and such taxes on it. It's they are the ones who've polluted majorly the world. So why is it not their responsibility themselves to clear it out? Why is it becoming a burden for other countries as well?
Yeah, definitely. That has been the stance of uh, not only Indian government but many of the developing countries for many years, and that is why we did not actually participate in many of the earlier programs. Like, I mean, it was not even a question of we not participating. Even the developed countries did not push us a lot. For example, if you look at Kyoto Protocol, and other agreements that happened earlier. But in the recent years, Copenhagen and Paris Agreement, we also have started doing this. Efforts to reduce emissions, commitments, and so on. So there are a few pros and cons, few reasons behind this. One is that we also we think about humanity as a whole and including our own future, others' futures, and so on. So from that perspective, this blame game cannot go on forever. Like we cannot say that okay, you guys polluted a lot, so we give us also some space and time to do that. Now we ourselves are agreeing now, like including India. If you look at a lot of statements made by our leaders, like including the PM, we have been very vocal, saying that we definitely want a sustainable future. We want to, reduce emissions and so on. But from the same logic, even today, even despite so much industrialization that is happening, even today, we like India, for example, is among the lowest in terms of emissions per capita. So we are not we are not shying away from our responsibility that we have to reduce emissions, but we are already contributing to that. We are already emitting very little, and of course we are a large country, so the total emissions may be high, but on a per capita basis we are emitting very low. So these are definitely some of the things that we have been talking about. In like the second thing I told you, when you are debating with them, we are going to fight with them in WTO and so on. We are going to use some of these arguments definitely, but then we should not also um, misunderstand this for complacency in reducing emissions and so on. So we are not complacent. We are doing a lot of taking so many efforts to enhance the renewable sector, reduce emissions, and so on. And like I already told you, we are already doing this emissions trading and all kinds of things. So that is one thing that we uh, do. The reason why we are being pushed in this direction, uh, kind of the positive reason is that all of us have to share the burden. But the negative reason is, like you said, that if you look at the historical trends, we hardly have done anything. All the emissions have come from the west. So these are the arguments that we are making. In fact, we are even thinking that why don't you if you are really concerned about emissions, why don't you go per capita basis? On per capita basis, we have low, you have high. So that should be the metric rather than saying that to produce something, how much emissions do you create. So these are all some discussions that are going on. But when it comes to the legality in the WTO framework and so on, there are these are all arguable. Like you can conclude either way, and that is how you have all this dispute settlement mechanism and appellate body which doesn't function. So there are a lot of issues there also in WTO, where we may or may not have the kind of chance or the just opportunity to defend our views there because of the broken system in the WTO in the last few years.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I think, yeah, what you very rightly said, we don't want to be part of the blame game. Whatever's already happened, we want to be part of the solution going ahead, because we are as a whole part of the world. So we want to be do what is best for everyone. So I think very rightly said, we're trying to maintain that balance where we don't take the entire onus, but at the same time try and support the West in their endeavor as well. So we've got a question from Shrishti. Uh, Okay, but we've not yet reached the saturation point. How do we account for that?
Yeah. So that is definitely one of the important arguments from our side, that we have a long way to go. Before we get into the development goals, the economic development part and so on. So that is the argument that you also mentioned, that the Western countries have taken so long. They have developed, they have taken efforts to become developed countries, and for that they have, in that process they also generate a lot of emissions. And we also, when we continue with our industrialization development process, we and we have not reached the saturation point yet. So what about, what how do you account for that? It's a good question. So now on this we have two types of answers. One, the positive answer, like which we are doing in the in the government in policies, is that we are there is a very explicit goal for continuing to grow rapidly, but also with a different type of different approach, rather than growing using emission intensive technologies, production and so on. Instead of that, we are moving towards green growth, what you can call as green growth, right? So one of the major challenges that our policymakers have over in the last few years and in the coming years, coming decades, is how to balance between this goals of sustainability and growth, and how do we finance when we have decided to go for this net zero transition, which is something that the Prime Minister has said, 2070 is the year by which we will become completely net zero. How do we arrive at that? Where do we get the finances for that? So these are all some questions that are still unanswered, and there's a lot of work to be done on how are we going to ensure that we continue to grow, continue to export, continue to produce more and more, and expand our manufacturing and so on, and at the same time reduce emissions. So that is why there is a lot of discussion about sectors like green hydrogen, and other renewables expanding and so on. I think that it is definitely feasible for us to go in that direction. But in the context of CBAM, our at least the push from the government and diplomatically is that, okay, we know our trajectory. We want to grow green over time, but we cannot be there cannot be unilateral decision that is imposed on us, that this is how you have to produce and export and so on. And that is our concern, and that is kind of related to what the previous person was raising. Definitely, the we are this is a very very important policy and strategic question in front of the government of India, and there is a need for greater interactions between the industry and the government in this regard. Because if you also talk to the industry, when I spoke to a lot of senior, top industries in India, they all have a much bigger ambition of becoming net zero by 2030 or something, like much earlier than the national target. Now I think so there is something to kind of exchange information, discuss as to what is feasible, what is not feasible, what are the things that we can accept from outside, what are things we should contest, and so on. So I think definitely this is an important question where there is a need for a lot of research, deliberations, stakeholder consultations, and so on. But given a chance, if we don't have this kind of policies and we can make our own decisions, then we would definitely not accept this kind of forceful imposition of tariffs. But right now we are not in a fair world, right? So we are in a world where these things don't happen automatically. So we have to fight for it, and if we don't succeed, we have to accept and do something, come up with other strategies.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think, Shrishti, hope we've answered that question very well. I think we've covered this topic in depth and in detail. There's just another question from Rajashi. Can factoring play a role in helping business navigate the financial implications of carbon taxes while maintaining competitiveness in the market? I think he wants to know a little bit more about what role exactly would banks and financial institutions be playing in this topic. to support MSMEs and exporters? Um,
I couldn't hear you, Ravish, again. There was some issue. Could you
okay, I'm just saying there's a question from Rajesh.
just
He's
just
just
don't?
wanting
I'm
to
not able to
know.
hear you. There's some issue.
Can you hear me now?
Um,
Uh, Please, viewers,
yeah, you
hold
can
on
repeat again, Srinath.
uh, till we figure out this technical difficulty with us. Uh, okay, can you? I think we can try again. You can hear me now. I think maybe you can answer the question on the screen if you
Yeah,
can
I can
see.
hear you now.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So, okay, we'll go ahead. So, I think Rajesh was just asking what role do you think banks, financial institutions are going to play, you know, going ahead with implications like carbon tax and all coming into the future to support, Indian manufacturers, exporters? Yeah, can you? Okay, I'll just repeat. You can hear me now clearly. I think we're on the same page. Can you hear me or not yet? Okay, I think
Yeah,
there's
sure.
some
I got the
delay.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's a delay
Um,
going on. Okay, yeah, you can sure you can take it on.
Yeah. So definitely, since by definition, factoring is meant to uh, generally help the exporters, where you pay with the receivables, with the invoice with the receivables. Uh, Definitely, it can uh, help the exporters to worry less about these issues and focus more on other issues that matter, like for example, let's say for example an exporter is currently producing something that is uh, like let's say Tata Steel, for example. They are producing steel, and it's not green steel yet. It still has a lot of embodied emissions. And now when they export it, of course Tata Steel is not a good example because it's a large company. Let's say there is an MSME who is exporting a steel product, and now the Europeans are going to right away, bill them the $80 or whatever the carbon tax is. So now financially it's going to be difficult for them because that is going to add up to their burden, and their costs are already high. So now what can be done is that they are going to over time reduce the emissions embodied in their production, and that's going to take time and effort and cost. But in the meantime, they are going to pay these taxes. So in that process, I think there is a scope for more and more of these kind of MSMEs to be served by um, uh, uh, you know companies like India Factory, while they can continue to focus on reducing their emissions and maintaining their competitiveness, and in the meantime for paying the taxes, going through those practical financial operations. Factoring can really help them because they don't have to um, you know they have to receive from the buyer, and then after that they have to only then they'll have the liquidity to pay these taxes. And now if you are doing this factoring, then you have that liquidity beforehand, so you have some level of flexibility to be able to pay, and then still sustain your operations and survive. If this were not there, they would be in trouble because they wouldn't have the kind of money, the physical working capital that is needed to sustain this kind of taxes. So I think that's what I think you have this the factoring is going to play a very solid role in this.
Thank you so much for answering. There's a new question from Manish, Mr. Manish Sanghi. Can bank provide finance at a lower rates to SMEs, MSMEs exporters who are following ECG norms? So, will some kind of a benefit be given considering they're sustainable and more green energy effective? Will that have an effect? Will banks be forced to, I'm guessing, give money at a lower rate?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that question, from Mr. Manish Sangvi. Definitely, there is scope for that. In general, you can definitely expect these kind of incentives where the interest rates can be lower, there can be interest subsidies, particularly if you're following these kind of norms. So this can be an incentive. But there are some difficulties here. If this becomes like a policy from the government, if it is a policy from the government wherein there is some tax incentives or subsidies, particularly focusing on the MSME exporters who are following these norms, it can be contested in the WTO again, saying that these are export subsidies. But if these are done like the way we did this production linked incentive scheme, right? Production linked incentives was very successful, and so far has not been challenged by any country in a big way, because these incentives are meant for production, not for exports. And we have been clever enough to find out, select the sectors where we have a lot of exports going on, and the sectors where we have a lot of imports going on, so we can develop some import substitution, export orientation, and some key sectors. So now that going by that, here what we can do is we can probably incentivize SMEs, not necessarily focusing on exports, but production in general, who are following these norms. Now there we can be selective. We don't have to subsidize all SMEs, MSMEs. We can focus on MSMEs, the sectors which are more export oriented, the way we did PLI. And there I think, I mean, the direct answer to your question is banks can definitely do that. Banks, nobody can stop the banks from doing that, because there is no, those are not called subsidies. But the making it a government policy, developing it as a government policy is difficult, if not impossible. But from that perspective, this kind of production subsidies, which can help the MSMEs to navigate through issues, could be a great idea. But yeah, banks can directly help the exporters. That is no problem. But then the public sector banks can do that, because they have some space to do that, and they have some mandates. Whereas the private banks may only, it's difficult to incentivize them to do that. Maybe it can actually, I mean, one thing that can happen is, if we have a very solid emissions trading system scheme kind of thing, then the banks also can buy carbon credits. Banks can say that, okay, we are doing this interest subsidies, and when we do that, we are actually reducing emissions, and then it becomes like a win-win. The banks also benefit from it, and it's not just a one way thing, that the banks spend this money, and then they don't get anything from it. So but if it is if there is a system in the country in place, wherein this emissions trading happen, the emission permits are tradable, then it takes everything to another level. This idea could also answer the previous question, the two questions before, on how do we do this when we have not reached the saturation point. So if the emissions also become like a commodity that is traded, Then we are coming up with a lot of market-based solutions. So the government's role becomes less. The market is going to, because emissions themselves have an inherent negative value. So now if you have something that is inherent, that has an inherent negative value, you are going to the market is going to take care of it. So that is something that a lot of countries are already talking about. Like some of the African countries are talking about carbon credits that can come from their forests that they have, and so resources that they have, and so on. So this can also be applicable to the banks potentially in the future. And this is, I don't think many banks have been thinking along these directions, but it can help. And this, whatever I told you so far, can also hold good for the factoring companies also, because factoring companies also can do the same. They can also claim carbon credit by providing this kind of incentives.
There's a lot to explore. I think we've got a lot of things to explore which can be done further in this field. Thank you so much for answering that question. Moving on to the next question from Mr. Gopi Krishna. Uh, Reaching the end buyer still remains a challenge for many MSMEs despite attending trade expos. How do companies make best use of policy developments like FTAs?
So there is a bit of a lag. I think
Yeah, no
I
worries.
think you're talking about this question, right?
Yeah, it will be the question on the screen.
The question from Gopi Krishna Hanumantaraj.
Yeah.
So yeah, on this question, um, it's definitely an important pain point that I've seen. I've noticed it being part of the government. I've seen that we have these FTAs. In fact, we actually from Niti Aayog we conducted a lot of dissemination workshops to help the MSMEs particularly to find whether their products are going to benefit from these FTAs, to what extent are they going to benefit, and so on. And but the thing is, there are three levels of barriers, right? The one barrier is the knowledge. Many MSMEs may not even know that these FTAs are being signed. Some MSMEs may not know whether their products are going to benefit from these FTAs, and then the MSMEs may not know what are the compliance requirements to avail the preferential tariffs or zero tariffs. And then other MSMEs may also know, like when you cross all these different barriers, not knowing the FTAs, not knowing whether FTAs matter for them, not knowing the compliance requirements for availing professional tariffs. Then finally, you may also know that, but you see that you find that that process of compliance is so expensive. So then if you also solve that problem, then finally then that's when you're going to look at the end buyer. So the challenge that you're talking about here is after crossing all these multiple barriers, lack of knowledge, lack of information, lack of resources for complying with the requirements and so on. So definitely it's a big pain point. Uh, so far, our focus has been to eliminate the other pain points before reaching this. So now on this point, expos and so on are not very helpful unless and until you have some niche product, or you have a clear cost advantage. If you're not doing anything niche, then, like, I remember long ago when I was talking to some startups, uh, we were just debating about the concept of innovation. So innovation in upcoming industries is the traditional definition of innovation, where you come up with some technological uh, breakthroughs and apply them and so on. But in the established industries, in the established processes, established products, what is innovation? It's basically process innovation, where you can minimize the costs. So I think that is what is going to be the big game changer for the MSMEs. How are they going to keep their cost advantage and and so on. Because the demand is always there, they can always find buyers if they can convince them that I'm going to export at a same quality that my competitor is exporting to you, but at a cost that is much lower than my competitor. So once you tell that, once you are able to make that story, you will be able to find the market. Expos are definitely a good starting point, but then in the expos, if you don't have anything clear cut to tell, a clear story to tell, obviously that's not going to be helpful. So I think that is the problem that many of our MSMEs are facing. Whenever they go to all these expos, they try their best, but at the end they see that their competitors, particularly the Southeast Asian countries apart from China, they really are extremely competitive. The prices are very low, quality is high, and so on. So the only way for us to find these buyers is the quality plank, the cost plank, and the stability, reliability kind of plank. But now the thing, what is happening is, one thing I can say is that the whole world, a lot of countries are trying to reduce their exposure to China, and now for, and many countries, interestingly, many buyers, many countries are interestingly looking at India as an alternative. And then very quickly they realize that we don't, in many industries, we don't have the kind of capacity, like the kind of capacity to displace China. And already one unfortunate thing that is happening widely is that these buyers who have been quite anxious to find something in India, when they don't find it, they already start moving towards Southeast Asia. And from Southeast Asia, what is also happening is that many Chinese companies are establishing their plants there, and that way all their cost advantage continues there. So that's the major issue now, and that is why it has been very difficult for MSMEs to find the buyers. So I think the moment they come up with innovations in terms of processes, in terms of cost saving procedures, and so on, they will be able to find these markets. I think that is the biggest thing: cost and quality and stability. Like that's what I was talking about before. What I was trying to say was, there is this supply chain, a lot of supply chain problems, delays in procuring stuff, and so on. So if we can come up with a solid supply chain stability of supply, and so on, then we can actually really go in a big way. I've seen even some transactions where um, many of the buyers in the US, for example, were looking for Indian sources, even MSMEs, but they couldn't find many. So it's more of a chicken and egg problem. So the MSMEs think that there are no buyers, but the buyers think there are no MSMEs in India that can produce. So there is a disconnect there, and it's partly because of our lack of preparedness and lack of cost advantage, and so on. So I think it's going to take some time, but we also should be cautious enough to not delay too much. So we have some time and some leeway for now, but it won't stay forever. So we have to be ready, and we have to gear up with all kinds of preparedness, and reduce the costs, expand quality, form alliances, have a robust supply chain, stable supply chain, and so on.
I think very rightly said, like the China plus one policy, with the sentiment of China plus one which existed globally, is slowly moving on. So India still is in that phase where they can take advantage of it. So my question is, following up to what you said, what more do Indian MSMEs, exporters, manufacturers need to do to take advantage of that sentiment? Otherwise, as you said, China is already using other strategies. There are other players like South Asian countries in the mix, and if India is not able to provide, India is the first choice. But if we are not able to provide, then they will move on to other countries. So, what is it that immediately our listeners, exporters, manufacturers can do to take advantage of that sentiment? You're working with a little delay, but sure, you can answer it once.
Yeah, sorry, there was a lag. I heard you.
Yeah, I totally
Um,
understand.
what I can say on this point is for the like what is missing, what is lagging, what can the MSMEs do, is to to basically look at the three broad things that I was talking about previously. One is the fact that they have to reduce their try hard to reduce their cost. Second is to raise their quality bar, quality standards. Then the third is the supply chain. The fourth thing, which I didn't talk about earlier, is also related to the next question that I can see from Ayush Joshi or some of the other discussion we are having about environmental standards and so on. So if we are able to, I mean, long ago, like a couple of decades ago, I wrote an article in EPW, Economic and Political Weekly, where I basically argued that I mean, even those days when we were, China was so big and we are not even close, and even now we are catching up, but those days we are far behind. One thing that I could see, generally, globally talking to people, buyers, and so on, was that because of our labor regulations and so on, which we think many times we think of them as human rights, global labor regulations, and all these things. Sometimes we think these are slowing us down in terms of development and so on, but they are also huge advantages of the country. So, as opposed to countries like China, where there is a question of human rights and so on. For example, the US recently came up with a legislation or a regulation where they would ban anything that is exported from the, the region in China where Uyghurs are exploited. So those kind of things are already happening. So we stand a better chance in these things because everyone knows that India is a democracy. We have good standards, regulations in place. Many times these standards, these regulations are a pain point for people. But how do we take advantage of that, and how do we position them as positive, what we used to call as CSR, what we now call as ESG, these kind of standards. If the MSMEs can be articulate about that, they can say that okay, you have we'll try our best to give you the cost advantage. We'll try our best to improve our quality, and we will be better than others, if not the same. I mean, will be same as others, if not better. And we will also, you can rest assured that we are treating our people very well. Our employees are treated well. We follow all the environmental regulations, standards, voluntarily adopting a lot of standards. Like we don't have to wait for CBAM to kick in. We can say that we are already following all your standards. We already produce green steel. What's the point about all these carbon taxes? We are already producing zero carbon. So I think that kind of being ahead of the market is something that the MSME should do, even though it is going to be costly. Like one thing in India, the good and bad thing about Indian MSMEs is that what we call today as bootstrapping, that has been their mode of operations from times immemorial. They've always been doing that. That is a good thing because they are self-sustaining. But at the same time, because of that, they are not risk-taking. So many times they think, okay, whatever works today, let's just continue with that. But I think we have to deviate from that attitude and think a little more longer term, both in terms of these kind of buyers. What are the things that matter for the buyers from a social environmental point of view, and we can actually market that these are the things we are doing and take efforts to do that, and comply with all kinds of global standards. And that is very important actually, complying with the global standards rather than coming up with our own standards and meeting them. Nobody is going to look at that. They're only going to see what are the global standards that you have complied with. I think that is something we should work very rigorously. Nowadays it's not a loose talk. It's not like just saying that we treat our workers well and so on. It's more like everything is very scientific. There are standards to comply with. You can get those certifications. you can say that these are the standards. Like in the olden days, we had ISO 9000, ISO 14000. We have upgraded versions of those. We have other kinds of standards. So I've also been of the view that the government also should come up with a lot of standards, make them mandatory rather than voluntary. But I think until that happens, that's a long process. The government to take a stance on that, it's going to take a lot of time, because once you make it mandatory, everyone's production cost will increase and so on. But in the meantime, the MSMEs that have ambition to capture the export markets, they should actually do it voluntarily. They have to comply with all these kind of different standards in voluntarily. So I think that would be a good way ahead. Let's see.
Uh, Thank you so much. Very well covered. We would actually love to continue further. It was a very pleasant and intriguing discussion, very light sharing discussion, and I would really like to consider. But just for the viewers, you've joined from USA. It's a little late in the night out there, so I would uh, take this opportunity to thank you so much for joining us and sharing all the insights. We would love to have you again because I don't think we did enough justice to this discussion. There were a lot of other things that we could cover, a lot of questions in the chat we've been unable to answer, which I'll answer on the back end. But still, thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure having you. For everyone else who wants to know more about India Factoring, you can log into our website www.indiafactoring.in or connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, anywhere. We'll be more than happy to answer questions and get in touch with you. Anything related to this topic as well. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next month with a new guest.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation too. Very intriguing questions, and I'm sorry that I couldn't answer all the questions because of a lack of time. But I think just very quickly before ending, I'll answer the last question about startups. Definitely, startups are they are going to play an important role. And when I spoke about all this MSMEs complying with standards and so on, startups can play a very important role there, because there is a lot of technological developments that can happen, lot of gaps that exist today. So startups have enough things to worry about that can come up. They can solve a lot of problems, you know, they could be the missing link actually. So the governments have their own difficulties. The industry has its own difficulties. So now we need some new ideas, innovations that can only come up from startups who can bridge this gap. So definitely that's a great point that came up. But thank you everyone. It was great talking to you, Neil, and with
Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so
wonderful
much
points.
for sharing your
Thank
wisdom,
you
sir.
so much.